Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. As we contemplate our future outside the EU, wondering what kind of country we're going to be, we need to look back at the country we've been. There's a huge amount of national pride invested in the wise, humane and non-violent ending of the British Empire. That's still a big part of who we think we are. But in an astonishing book, the writer Ian Cobain reveals the mass destruction of records and archives and the false memory that it's left us with. Where, though, does that leave the rest of the empire? I'm also joined by the former politician, healthcare worker and hospital founder Edna Adan of the Republic of Somaliland, once a British protectorate, by Valerie Amos, former cabinet minister, and now director of where the world looks very, very different from, to Edna Adan. And Edna, before we get into the story of British Somaliland, as it used to be called, let's hear a little about you yourself, because you were brought up as the daughter of a doctor, and you became a very well-known gynecologist and midwife,
Mm-hmm.
and then founded your own hospital.
Yes. Well, I was very privileged. I was the first female to have sat for an examination way back in the early 50s, to sit for an examination that would win me a scholarship or otherwise to come to Great Britain. And I was very fortunate to have won that. Came to Britain in 1954. Went to school, completed my secondary education, then, of course, followed up my passion to become a nurse.
Which is midwifery in particular.
Nurse, and then specialised in midwifery, and went back to Somaliland in 1961.
And why midwifery in particular?
Midwifery in particular because, well, my passion during nursing was surgical nursing, that operating theatres, that was my passion. But then there was a question that my father asked once and said, what will you do when you qualify as a nurse? Surgery is good, but what are you going to do for women when you come home? And women in labour and pregnant women are going to need you. And I thought, oh my God, I've had so many privileges, and he's spent so much on my education.
Very enlightened father you have.
Very. Someone whose shoes I could not even fill a fraction of. So I thought, well, women, babies, screaming babies, nappies, that's not really what I wanted to do. But since my father thought it would be important, I followed up on this. And from the first day I delivered my first baby at Hammersmith Hospital here in London, in Duquesne Road, my passion turned from surgery to mothers and babies and the prevention of women dying from causes they need not die of in developing countries such as mine. That led me to become a nurse midwife educator for the World Health Organization. I started training and teaching nurses in my country, Somaliland, after we had become independent from Britain. And through a moment of absolute historical madness, united with neighbouring Italian Somalia, started training nurses and midwives, started training midwives in Libya in the early 60s, started training midwives in Djibouti, and midwifery has been my passion. My current passion is to train 1,000 midwives for my country and hopefully 1 million for Africa.
And you were involved in politics, but you also founded a hospital which was built on what had been an execution ground.
A killing ground. I live on it, yes. I retired from the World Health Organization, spent many privileged years where I learned a lot, taught a lot, gained a lot, earned a lot, saved a lot, and used my terminal benefits and my pension and my repatriation grant and all the trinkets that I no longer had any use for, cashed them into cold cash,
Good for you.
Went home, built a hospital on a site that was considered cursed. Today, the hospital is a referral hospital. We treat patients from anywhere in the world, any part of the Horn of Africa, and we do surgery that is not available anywhere else. Children with hydrocephalus come to us because we have the means to operate and insert shunts in the heads of these little children to drain the cerebrospinal fluid. And we've operated over nearly 400 children, and most of the operations are performed by students, by a doctor today, who was a nurse, one of my first nurses, one of my first midwives, and then who I sent through medical school, and who has come back in 2011 and is the referral person for children with hydrocephalus.
It's a great...
What you can do on a killing ground, has no limits.
It's a great story, and I want to bring other people in, but before we do, I want to talk about, you've mentioned several times, my country, Somaliland. Now, we want to talk a little bit about Somaliland. First of all, geographically, for those who are vague, the Horn of Africa, Somaliland is the top bit, basically.
Yes, there was La Côte Française des Somalie, French Somaliland, French Somaliland, which is now the Republic of Djibouti, where you have very big military bases in the
Gulf of Aden.
In the Gulf of Aden, at the mouth of the Red Sea. Then you have British Somaliland Protectorate, never a colony, but a protectorate. And then we have to our east La Somalia Italiana, the Somalia that you all know today, famous for all kinds of things.
And so when people say Somali and Somali pirates, they're talking about Somali.
Ethnic.
Not
well, they're talking about
Somaliland.
Somalia. No, we don't have pirates in Somaliland. We don't have terrorists in Somaliland. We don't have warlords in Somaliland. We have a stable, democratically elected government in Somaliland.
So the really interesting thing about Somaliland, as opposed to Somalia, is it is not recognised around the world as a country. You don't have huge amounts of insider, people
it is the
pouring
most senior
in.
of the two countries, by the way.
It's
exactly what Ian was talking about. The history of Somaliland has been so destroyed and distorted that people forget about the older partners, Somaliland, the first-born independent Somali nation in the Horn of Africa, which is Somaliland.
And you're not recognised by the United Nations. You don't have lots of white-helmeted people there. And you're doing all right.
You don't spend billions of taxpayers' money in Somaliland, but you do in Somalia, which you are the countries of the world recognise. Somaliland is stable. Somalia has democratically elected government. Somaliland is where a woman such as me could build a hospital with her pension.
Everybody's interested. Everyone wants to jump in. Keith Somerville.
One thing I find very interesting about Somaliland, and I don't know if you'd agree with me, is that in a strange way, the lack of recognition has been a boon. You haven't had foreign NGOs, foreign donors trying to dictate
no
to
World
you
Bank,
your
no
system.
IMF, no bilateral aid. We've learned to live with the means that we had at our disposal. We have learned to become masters of improvisation. We have learn to survive with the little that we have.
And it's been better for you.
We should be an example to African countries where billions of dollars are being spent. Peace is not maintained in Somalia. In spite of all the money you've spent, Somaliland is peaceful.
Valerie Amos.
Well, this is very interesting because there's a whole debate that's been going on about what is aid for and who is it for. And there are a lot of young people, for example, on the African continent, in many countries in Asia and everywhere else, that say that actually the whole aid business, the whole aid industry is not for us. It's not to assist and help to empower our countries. It's actually for you countries in the West, to assuage your guilt. And I think that this discussion about Somaliland and how Somaliland has managed to be stable, to essentially to restore itself after that civil war of many years with Somalia, and has done that without a huge amount of support from outside.
It's an extraordinary experimental question mark. What would it be like if we hadn't done all these things in Africa? Somaliland suggests that in many ways things would be better, not worse.
But today we have a drought, one of the worst droughts in the world. In the history of my country is happening. But because Somaliland is not recognised and Somaliland is not around the discussion tables, Somaliland is excluded. So there is something in support of not giving too much aid, but then the isolation is then another extreme.
I wanted to ask Edna the question of whether she accepts the argument which is made by the African Union and others, which is that recognition of Somaliland opens up, as it were, a hornet's nest in terms of other parts of the African continent, but also other liberation movements, independence movements in other parts of the world.
Very good question, Baroness Amos, because Somaliland is a country that had its own defined borders. It was a country that existed before the African Union. Somaliland is senior to 12 independent countries in Africa. It was the 12th country to become independent. It is bigger than 18 countries and more populous than 18 countries in Africa. Somaliland is an example of democracy. Somaliland is being punished for the sins of neighbouring countries like Somalia.
Ian Cobain.
Edna, I wanted to ask, given that Somaliland is a former British protectorate.
And very proud of it.
And given that it has a functioning government within what is otherwise has been at times a failed state, are you surprised that the British government has declined to
I'm very
recognise it?
surprised. I can understand others not knowing where Somaliland is. Somaliland was part of the great British Empire. Our sons fought alongside your sons to defend causes that the free world was defending. The only Victoria Cross in the front during the Second World War was awarded to a Somalilander for defending the troops of Somaliland at that time, Second World War.
If only we had a former member of the Foreign Office round the table to respond. Oh, yes, we do.
I hope they're listening
Valerie
in.
Amos, why do you think that we haven't recognised Somaliland?
I think it's partly to do with pressure from the African Union and others with respect to this issue of independence movements. I think that it's partly historic. I also think that it's to do with attention. I don't think that Somaliland necessarily gets the attention in foreign affairs given what is happening in Somalia itself, which takes up a huge amount of time and a huge amount of resources. And I remember, as a Foreign Office Minister, having to answer a question actually about recognition. And I hope I'm remembering this right. It was a very, very long time ago. And the answer that I had to give was that the British government recognised states, not governments. And I have to say, I didn't understand the answer then, even though I gave it, and I still don't understand it now.
Me neither.
All right, well, let's move on to something else happening all across Africa, which has fascinated and appalled people from the rest of the world all the way through, which is the ivory trade. Keith Somerville, you've written an exhaustive book on the history of the ivory trade, going right back to very, very early times, and demonstrated, I think, in that book that there's always been outside appetite for ivory. It's always changed African history, going right the way back. Including the Chinese appetite for ivory, I hadn't realised was because, of course, there used to be a lot of Chinese elephants until they killed them all.
Yes, demand for ivory has been there for millennia. The Chinese were actually sending fleets to the Middle East, to the coast of Africa, as long ago as the 14th century, to trade for things like ivory and spices. There was huge demand for ivory from the pharaohs in Egypt. They sent fleets along the Red Sea, up the Nile, once they'd wiped out the elephants that used to exist on the fringes of the Mediterranean and the fringes of the Sahara. So the trade has been there, and now something like 75%, perhaps maybe even 80% of the ivory that is poached in Africa finds its final market in China. Though we do have to be careful not to be holier than thou in Britain and in America, for example.
The Chinese, I think, now have tougher rules than we do on the trade of ivory inside China.
On paper. On paper. In fact, not really. There is still a booming trade, and where they've made efforts, partly for cosmetic global respect reasons, to close off some routes, they've opened up in other areas. So Vietnam is now a major route across their land border for ivory, but also rhino horn going into China. And there is a massive, massive market there, and it's not really falling away. But also, Britain still has a legal trade in what is called antique ivory. And there is considerable evidence that a lot of what is called antique ivory is not antique ivory at all, because DNA and other forms of testing can show how old it is. And it's much more recent. It's poached ivory.
Going right back to the beginnings of European interest in ivory, a lot of this came from mammoths, is that right?
Yes.
I find it extraordinary.
Mammoth ivory, mammoth carcasses, particularly across the wastes of Siberia and into bits of European Russia, were exploited for ivory. And some of the earliest ivory carving from thousands of years ago was mammoth ivory. And this helped create a market and create a demand, because people suddenly decided here was something that was incredibly attractive. And when you see these carvings, even knowing the appalling route by which the ivory has become a carving, these carvings can be absolutely exquisite. Wonderful pieces of art, yet It is drawn from a very bloody trade.
And to be clear about it, at the moment, more elephants are being killed by ivory poachers than are being born. So African elephants are dying out unless something is done. You make the case in the book that this is really a story about power, who owns what. And part of the story, I guess, is the lack of power of African communities over their own areas. And that goes back to the aftermath of the Second World War and the arrival of the great big boom in tourism, I guess, basically, essentially.
Well, even further back than that, as soon as the British moved into areas of Africa to control it, to occupy it, take Kenya, for example, they criminalised hunting by Kenyan communities that had lived through hunting or hunting supplementing farming for centuries and had not decimated the elephant herds. The British moved in, banned Africans from hunting, but then
brought in the big
game hunters, but also some of the rangers, some of the famous rangers. George Adamson, for example, of Born Free fame, he was a hunter. And on the one hand, as a game ranger, he would persecute, under law, of course, colonial law, persecute Africans for hunting elephants or for hunting other animals. He would then buy licenses and hunt himself and make money from selling the ivory, as did David Sheldrick and Bill Woodley in Savo, who fought the first militarised war just after the Mau Mau, the Land and Freedom Army rebellion, fought this war in Savo against African poachers and began the process of militarisation of anti-poaching, which, while one can understand, you've got to have armed rangers to protect elephants because the rangers themselves become targets, the militarisation further alienates the local people who've been pushed out of the protected areas, who are banned from hunting, and then suddenly they find themselves harassed by militarised anti-poaching units.
And you get, therefore, the wave of independence movements. And what happens to the safari parks under independence?
They realised, particularly in Kenya and Tanzania, that here was something that could actually bring in money. And so they retained the rules. They retained the protection. It was state-owned, and still very, very little power of the local people. They became, if anything, even less empowered, pushed out as parks were expanded, and tourism earnings, which never trickled down to the local people, became the goal.
Valerie Amos.
I was going to ask Keith a question about tourism, but I think you've partly answered it, Keith, which is big game parks have become part of the tourism sale of many countries. What impact is that having on communities now, and what do you think that those communities can do to begin to redress this balance?
One effect that it has is to continue keeping them out of areas. Tourists who go to Africa, to safari parks, and I'm an avid safari goer myself. Tourists don't want to go into parks and see people. They don't want to see livestock. They don't want to see houses and farms abutted right up to the edge of a park, which is the case in many areas. And so people get further pushed out and further pushed out. And as land is also sold off, you've recently had the situation in Tanzania, where I was earlier in the year, where a large area of non-protected land is now owned by rich people in the UAE, and they are gradually pushing out the Maasai who have traditionally moved their cattle into that area.
And so can I just nail this down, Keith? What you're saying is that the historic connection between people who've been living in an area for centuries and the wildlife there is broken, first by colonialism and then by the modern governments. Those people are pushed out. They have nothing else to do. They become the poachers. They become the demonised, and we are in the situation we're in, where they are, as it were, always going to win.
Yes, because if you're a local person, say, on the edge of Selous in Tanzania, massive great game reserve where there is a huge poaching problem, you are not allowed to hunt game in that area to feed your family or to sell anything, yet your children are going hungry, you can't afford school fees or clothes. What do? The crime syndicates that run poaching massive crime syndicates with political protection from corrupt politicians in many countries. They come to you and say, look, here's $100. Go and shoot an elephant and bring me the tusks. $100 will be more than they will earn in a year. And yet they're not allowed to do it legally, even in areas where there are too many elephants.
I want to come on to your solution in a moment. Before I do, first Ian and then Valerie again.
Keith, I've seen it said since 9/11 that there's some sort of connection between ivory hunting and terrorist organisations, particularly Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Is that correct?
No. There's a tiny, tiny connection. This was a wonderful, perfect storm, you could say, that could be exploited by Western governments, because they could say, look, here's this appalling organisation, Al-Shabaab. They're Islamists. They've pledged their support for Al-Qaeda. They're appalling people. And, oh, my God, they're killing elephants as well. So you can justify even harsher policies because you can stack the cards so there are more crimes. Then NGOs can say, we need more money for elephant conservation and for militarised anti-poaching, because look who's involved now. But the evidence of Al-Shabaab involvement is tiny, absolutely tiny.
Given how far this has gone, is there any way of preserving livelihoods and doing conservation at the same time?
I think there is. There have been experiments. There was a very good one that's still running but not running so successfully now in Zimbabwe called Campfire, where local people gained power over the wildlife in their areas. These were outside national parks, but people have got to remember that in Africa, huge amounts of the wildlife are outside national parks and people live alongside them. And so people, under this scheme, had a certain amount of power. They could crop game, for example, like impala, for meat. They could sell hunting quotas if they existed to make money. And what they did is they then protected their resource. They were again empowered. Here was a resource, and it's working particularly well at the moment in northern Namibia, in community-based sustainable use conservancies, where the elephant population is rising, where even the black rhino population, very endangered animal, is being protected, and people are making livelihoods. And you've then got a new sort of virtuous circle. The people get a livelihood, they get a sense of ownership, they protect the animals, and there is limited regulated cropping, and it works to preserve the animals and, importantly, to give people a livelihood and a sense of ownership. And I think that is...
Sense of ownership, absolutely crucial. Keith, thank you very much. Edna, you had elephants in Somaliland once upon a time.
Yes, we had elephants. In fact, the last one was killed in the late 50s. But whatever elephants were in the Horn were also commercialised, and trade. They became an item of trade by corrupt politicians. And Siad Barre's family members would export warehouses full of ivory, as well as leopard skins and cheetahs. So it was criminal for somebody else to trade in it, but then the family in power could, and that pushed the price up. And then that also brought the Somali image to it, because the traders that were hired by Siad Barre and by eventually the Shabab and whoever replaced Siad Barre were Somalis, and it was the AK-47 that did it. It made the poacher such an easy. So easy for them to kill.
So this is partly about an arms race, as it were, in Africa as well. But can I come on?